If I don't write this down, I'll have to remember it word for word. And the reason I was never an actor is because I could never learn my lines. For similar reasons, in this instance, a decision was made to pre-record my voice reciting the words I had written. This is the voice you were hearing now, unless you were reading this at a later date, in which case the words on paper or screen may be accompanied by the silent voice of the disembodied narrator that we all carry inside our heads. A voice that strangely can never be absolutely pinned down in terms of tone, timbre, or expression. But it was a voice I've always been acutely aware of, paradoxically because I'm not entirely sure what it sounds like. I think it might be deeper than the voice you're hearing now. And as a child, I would open my mouth and expect the words I heard inside my head to somehow metamorphose into sound upon contact with light and air. Perhaps it was because of this tendency that the only significant role I've ever had in a character-based stage production was playing the role of the Archbishop of Canterbury in a school pageant at about the age of 9 years old. Of course, a pageant is not a proper school play, and these events are always more to do with procession and elaborate costume rather than virtuoso acting skill. The important thing to bear in mind, however, is that because of the acoustic challenges of performing outdoors, it was arranged that all voices would be recorded onto tape in advance of the show and played back during the pageant through a series of loudspeakers arranged around the audience. These were mainly monologues, exposition, very much directed to and for the gathering. Now, although my character had been recorded making a somewhat declamatory speech, I was told not to mime, not to mouth the actual recorded words. In fact, using my mouth at all was discouraged, but rather it was suggested that I pose with a series of stylized gestures that bore some kind of relation to the recorded oration. An outstretched palm here, a clenched fist there. All the audience needed to do was to make a connection between my gestures and a series of words battered out of shape by the increasingly vicious prevailing winds. My lips weren't moving, so I can't be speaking, but I can hear my voice, so I must be speaking. But my lips aren't moving, but I can hear my voice, as can the audience. It's hard to articulate the level of discombobulation I experienced. Maybe it lasted for just a split second, but by the culmination of my performance, my punctuative bodily gestures had collapsed inwards into a series of thoughtful facial expressions, bewildered at best, gormless at worst, with the speech, to me, becoming the voice of an internalized narrator who had somehow slipped out through a gap in my lips and was now outside of my body. So here I stood, reduced to acting out the act of thinking. I think. Thinking I would like the tape to finish so I could leave the stage. I did. And some of the parents applauded. The problem is always the same. The act of writing is not very interesting, cinematic. It's a guy sitting, maybe he's interesting. Maybe he wears a hat. Maybe he drinks and smokes. But basically he sits and types. It's an interior act. David Cronenberg is talking here about his experiences of adapting William Burroughs' novel Naked Lunch for cinema. How he wanted to make a film depicting the physical process of writing, but wanted to avoid the stereotypical, the close-up shots of writing devices and apparatus, hands frantically gripping pens, random scribbling, or fingers tapping on a keyboard. More often than not, the text tumbling out fully formed. And continuing in these stereotypical terms, occasionally the author will pause. Frown, and then continue writing with a fresh sense of purpose. Then there is Michel Foucault's notion of the body-machine complex. Over the whole surface of contact between body and object it handles, power is introduced, fastening them to one another. It constitutes a body weapon, body tool, body-machine complex. A machine being humanised or a body being mechanised. And there is that moment when the writing machine may say something that the writer doesn't recognise, something the writer hasn't heard before. But if the author claims to confide in their writing machine, then the machine will claim authorship. One year I decided not to attend the school disco. Instead I stayed at home and concentrated on my GCSE English assignments. What emerged was a short story entitled Underground, about a man who was inexplicably chased around the London tube network by a brutal and unrelenting psychopath. The origins of this story are unclear, but it was written on this typewriter. It was purchased in the mid-1960s by my mother for the purpose of learning how to type, to keep herself busy, she said. I felt that to be a proper writer, one needed to use a typewriter. And I've always said one of the things that motivated me to write in the first place was the existence of the 3 plays and 1 novel that my father wrote as a young man. Unseen, unpublished, unperformed, and again, all written on this typewriter. As time passed, I began to think about the implications of objects that record everything. Not in the sense of a computer having a memory that can be accessed through data retrieval, keystroke by keystroke, that's too easy. But rather like the idea of the stone tape, the idea that past events are somehow recorded into the fabric of a building and occasionally manifest themselves in the form of paranormal disturbances. In this case, I started to think about the notion that everything that has been written on this machine still somehow inhabits it, and that subsequent users are locked into a feedback loop of tropes and narratives contained within the machine. I had an image of these texts not only buried in a file under my father's bed, but also buried within the machine's subconscious, occasionally to emerge and distort the ego of the writer. Mother exits via the door. Norman picks up pieces of the broken plate that lie before him on the table. He examines them carefully. Curtain. Her footsteps are heard crossing a hard floor. Door opens and closes. Footsteps on the street. Footsteps gradually fade into the distance. End. Thank you.